I will take the liberty of standing on this piano bench so that I can see you. We will hope that it is.
Watch your head.
Watch your head, watch your head.
That would be a moment.
You stand on lots of things when you're running. My first time in the Quad Cities in Iowa in January, they had me stand on this stool, and I didn't notice that there was a ceiling fan. Right about there, all I saw was this kind of look of just alarm in people's eyes, and I thought, wow, they're so excited to see me. And then it turned out they were just wondering whether I was going to survive. I think we're all right here. I'll be as abbreviated as I can in the monologue part so we can have a bit of a conversation, but let me state a little bit, first of all, why I'm running, what this campaign is about, and why I think this is the way for us to not only take back the presidency, but set the tone for a better era in American life. I believe right now, well, thank you. We're at one of these forks in the road, just a make or break moment for the country. And I know that the chaos and extremism and the fear that we're seeing amid this presidency has highlighted that. But to me, it's bigger even than the fact of this presidency. You've got to ask yourself how somebody like this president ever came within cheating distance of the Oval Office to begin with.
Amen.
And I would argue that doesn't happen unless the country's already in a kind of crisis. Something that would not come as news, certainly in the industrial Midwest where I'm from, but also I think to a generation that has grown up watching our country accept the unacceptable on everything from inaction around climate to inaction on gun safety to allowing an economy to develop where it's possible for the GDP number to go up and life expectancy to go down in the same year. You got to think about what it means for that to even be possible. I think what it tells us is that we've got to deliver something different in terms of how our political and economic systems respond to the needs of the moment. We're not going to win, or frankly deserve to win, if all we have to say is back to normal. Yes, we could do without the chaos and the drama that is emanating from the White House right now. But that doesn't mean we're going back to where we were. We're fashioning something new and better. And when the time comes to do that, you got to reach back to your deepest principles, values that I think have been taken over as if they belong to one party, but are in fact not Republican values, but rather American values with progressive implications. That will be the foundation for my presidency. An understanding of freedom, for example, that recognizes that there's more to freedom than cutting a tax or a regulation somewhere. That if we really want to experience freedom, that means making sure that everybody has health care, because you're not free if you don't. It means making sure that we have the economic freedom that comes from it being impossible to work full-time and also be poor. It means making sure that we are protecting women's reproductive freedom in a moment when it's under assault. I would also argue that freedom comes by way of education, which is why one of my first actions will be to appoint a Secretary of Education who actually believes in public education. So you see, when we take freedom seriously, it takes us in a different direction. It's the same thing with patriotism. I am out to end this idea that patriotism requires you to be right-wing. At a moment when national security compels us to pay attention to 21st century realities that include cybersecurity and election security. They're not going to respond to a 17th century security strategy like put up a wall. It's not going to be that easy. Security means dealing with white nationalist violence before it claims one more life in this country. Security means preventing the Second Amendment from being twisted into an excuse to allow thousands of Americans to die for the lack of common sense gun safety measures.
Yes.
And security means attending to our climate, because climate disruption is serious. So when we're serious about freedom, when we're serious about security, we can also reclaim them from the political monopoly, just like we're doing with faith. We're insisting that God does not belong to a political party, and finding a lot of people are ready to hear that message. The fundamental propulsion of this campaign is attention to the future, and it's how we're building the generational alliance that is making it possible for us to move forward in this race. It's people barely old enough to vote. and it's people my parents' age who have in common a focus on making sure the future is better than the past. I'm doing events around the country, and the hardest questions to respond to are coming from kids who are not yet old enough to vote. Last time I was in LA, we were at a startup incubator co-founded by Nipsey Hussle that is helping people from underserved backgrounds create businesses. There was a group touring of 13, 14-year-olds from the Midwest, actually. Black and Latinx students showing promise in coding and science who are going to be the next generation of tech entrepreneurs. And a 14-year-old there came up and asked me what I would advise he do about the racial tension going on in his school. I asked him what he meant by racial tension. And he described being called racial slurs in the hallway of his school in 2019 at the age of 14. And he has been taught to refer to that as tension when it's abuse. And this is what he's worried about when we want him to be concentrating his efforts on how to become a great coder and eventually a great business person. I had a 12-year-old in Orlando ask me about my plan on health insurance. And I thought, that's pretty cool, 12-year-old who cares about health. Wise beyond her years, like Brian Goldsmith used to be, encyclopedic knowledge of policy years before you would expect it. Then she explained why she was asking, and it was because she's got diabetes and is afraid of what will happen to her in the event that her parents are no longer able to get her coverage. She's worrying about this at the age of 12. A 13-year-old asked me about gun violence. Actually, that happens just about every stop I make. And then begin crying, worried about what's happening in his school. And the only good answer I can give to these kids is we who are old enough to vote and we who hold office are supposed to deal with this so that you don't have to. You shouldn't have to be thinking about racial abuse, health insurance, or gun violence. You should be concentrating on being a kid. You should be concentrating on growing up. And our responsibility is to make that happen. So the purpose of this campaign and the purpose of my presidency will be able to look them in the eye in the not very distant future, like 10 years from now, when they're 22 and 23 and 24, and say that while I'm sorry it ever got to that point that you had to ask me questions like that we got a lot to be proud of now, that we should be proud of what we did in 2020 to deliver the kind of reality that we want to do. But that all falls to us, and it falls to whether we win. And I can't say it much better than was said in the introduction, that in order to win, we have to make sure we're not trying too hard to play it safe. Because if we look like the defenders of the system, we're actually going to have a really hard time winning, especially where I come from. So, hopefully that gives you a sense of who I am and why I'm running and what I'll do. But again, I don't want to extend the monologue. I'd love to hear questions or thoughts from you. Yes, ma'am.
Nancy DeVille, Prison Yoga and Meditation. We're an LA-based nonprofit, and we see firsthand the inequity and injustices in our prison and jails. So what are you going to do about mass incarceration to end it and to help the millions of people who are suffering because of it?
Yeah. So our vision for criminal justice reform is to end America's status as the most incarcerated society in the modern world. And I have laid out a series of steps we can take that will cut by half the amount of incarceration in this country. Now, obviously, that requires leading in ways that the states will respond to, because a lot of it's happening there. But if we end incarceration as a response to simple possession, if we use the clemency powers of the presidency in order to make sure that we are ending incarceration in the many, many cases where the incarceration has done more harm than the original offense that it was a response to, then we're finally doing something about a problem that I'm seeing develop in South Bend, where we're now living with the generation of people who experience the trauma of the incarceration of a parent that practically dares them in turn to wind up in an encounter with the justice system. You add that to the fact that there is profound racial inequity in this, and it is an urgent issue for our country. And the other thing we've got to do is make sure that reentry is something that we all have a stake in. This is why we've got to end the Medicaid exclusion, because what it does is it gives people with addiction issues very little chance of success when they emerge. We've got to end the Section 8 housing exclusion, because housing is one of the main things that you need when you reemerge in order to get back on your feet. And if we take that away from you, we are almost telling you to go back into the system. And this is not just about being merciful, although we should live our values when it comes to how we treat other human beings. But it's also about our own communities and making every community has every stake in people succeeding when they emerge. So I really want to honor the work that you are doing to bring healing and bring health into these environments to those who are incarcerated. But we need a much more enlightened policy that recognizes how important that work is to do. So thank you. Yes, sir.
We have $1 trillion annual deficit, and Democrats come in, they're going to want to do a lot of programs. I'm a developer of affordable housing,
Yep.
and we have a big problem doing housing for homeless and lower income people because there's limited funding.
Right.
And so I would like to say, what would you do about affordable housing and homelessness? Okay, it needs money, it needs
Right.
federal assistance, yet we have $1 trillion deficit.
Right.
How do you address that? I haven't heard that conversation.
Yeah, I'm glad you raised that. I'm probably much more concerned about deficits and debt than is fashionable among Democrats. Partly out of generational concern, because I think we've got fiscal time bombs being set right now that will go off in my lifetime. Partly because it turns out that Republicans who speak a lot and worry a lot about deficits, once they're elected to Congress and get to Washington, reveal that they don't actually care. And that means that if the Democratic Party doesn't start caring about deficits, nobody will. Nobody will do anything. And we've seen that right now in what's happening in Washington. So the good news is, if we are willing to have a balance in revenue and in what we promise, we can get there. But it's one reason you'll notice that I'll stop short of some of the promises that my competitors to the left are making. Not because I don't believe in delivering all kinds of enhanced investments on things from housing to education to health, but because I don't think it's a priority to make sure that we have paid down the last penny of tuition for the wealthiest, even the wealthiest student in college, when we still got some basics we got to take care of. And then part of it is on the revenue side. Look, most developed countries, about 1/3 of their GDP goes through the public in some way. Not always national government, sometimes local, but if you add it all up, schools, libraries, county taxes, federal, it's about 1/3. For us, it's 1/4. And in that difference between 1/4 and 1/3 lie all of the ways in which our public things, our public infrastructure, public health, and public education are inferior. Not that money is all it takes, but if we invested better and actually balanced that budget, then we would be able, collecting revenue, not in some crazy punitive way, we're not going back to the JFK era 90% tax brackets, just making sure that, you know, if Amazon makes billions of dollars of profits, then maybe they should pay more rather than less in federal income taxes than I did last year. And if we do that, if we make sure we have the right tax structure and make sure we don't make promises we can't keep, we can be on top of our deficits, and we had better. Because otherwise this will catch up to us, and it will catch up to us, I think, sooner than we would like to admit.
What kind of progress is your campaign making with minority voters?
Right. So the biggest thing that we're doing by way of reaching out to minority voters is substance plus contact. So the substance includes the Douglas Plan. The idea here is that we need a plan as ambitious as the Marshall Plan that rebuilt Europe, but this time invested in dismantling systemic racism right here at home. Because the truth is, every time we sit, especially at home with activists, talking about issues like incarceration or policing, you can't start a conversation about criminal justice without it ending being also a conversation about economic empowerment. And you can't really talk about the economic side without talking about education, and that's connected to health, and that's connected to housing. And each of these things has specific, measurable impacts of systemic racism. Good news is there are specific things we can do about it. From tripling the number of black entrepreneurs in this country, to supporting minority-serving institutions and HBCUs in education, to a 21st Century Voting Rights Act that makes sure that people of color are adequately represented in our politics that will lead to the country making better political decisions. Now, every time we take this vision out on the road, it gets an enthusiastic response, from a standing ovation at the Rainbow Push Coalition to a great audience response when we were at the Essence Festival, NAACP, the Urban League, you name it. But the better part of engagement is going to be quieter, off-the-record conversations that we're having often with faith leaders or activists, maybe a dozen at a time as we travel. And the reality is they might not pay off for months, because what I'm finding, especially when we're speaking to black voters in the South, is they feel that they have been told the same things for as long as they've been alive, with very little by way of results, abused by the Republican Party and ignored or taken for granted by the Democratic Party. And so part of what I'm asking them to do is watch the way I talk to mostly white audiences about these issues too, so that we can put away the idea that that white people don't experience race. but rather acknowledge the fact that everybody needs to have a stake in dealing with systemic racism. And it's going to be a lot of quantity time developing that. It's paying off in our early relationships, but it will not be until the end game that a lot of voters make up their minds because they are so skeptical. And there's such a high bar both for credibility and viability right now when we're talking about some of the voters we're seeking to appeal to.
Hi. I want you to be president. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here. And no more Mayor Pete, President Pete. But what I want to say is, when you guys are at the next debate and you're all, the 10 of you are standing in your have a good show circle before the debate and supporting each other, can you guys make a pact that whoever it is,
Yes.
you all get behind them, full-throated, full voice. We can't have 2016 again. All of you guys. Whoever it is. I hope it's you. I want it to be you.
No, that's absolutely. Look, there's like 24 candidates who are going to not be the nominee. Right? So much depends on whether they rally around the one who is, and we've got to unify quickly. And I'm committed to it, and I'd like to believe all the others are too. But we'll continue pushing for that as we go. Thanks for that. You're absolutely right. Yes, ma'am.
What are your policy thoughts on cleaning up this absolute dumpster fire of human rights abuses with Trump's immigration policies and the child separations?
Yeah.
And how are we going to solve that in our first days?
Yeah. Right.
And how are we going to handle the long-term trauma and effects that we have caused so many children and
Right.
families? So
Yeah. It's so short term, medium term,
Exactly.
long term.
yes.
Short term, we immediately end any possibility of child separation at the border and child detention, especially for-profit child detention, because it has no place. We shift toward managing the border. Look, we're always going to have a border, which is fine. We've got to manage it in a way that's consistent with our values as well as our laws. That means when you do have situations where people are being housed, you take it out of Customs and Border Protection, which is an enforcement agency, and put it in Health and Human Services, which is responsible for care. You reinstitute family case management, and you recognize that asylum is a right, that people are exercising a legitimate lawful right when they come here seeking asylum. So there are a number of things we can do day one by executive order. Medium term, we need immigration reform. Clearly, we need immigration reform. And by the way, I have been really heartened by seeing how when I travel, we took a bit of a risk in my rural economy plan, which is a big part of what we propose to do for communities in rural areas that are having a big problem just with losing population, is look at immigration as part of the solution. Invite communities to apply for community renewal visas to help them grow just numbers. It's based on my experience in South Bend, where immigration has been the lifeblood of our comeback. And more than I had thought, people are embracing that even in conservative areas. Because the communities that have really vicious attitudes toward immigrants are the ones that don't have any and don't know any. In many others, it's part of what's bringing these small towns back to life. So we can have a different kind of conversation about immigration that also includes the reforms we know we need: a pathway to citizenship, protection for dreamers, reform to the system that deals with these backlogs and country quotas, and gives us a system that's actually going to work for the long run. That's the medium term. The long term is we have a stake in people prospering at home. Most of that, I met another yesterday, Salvadoran asylum seeker is explaining, like, I'm not even after the American dream. I'm just trying to get away from the nightmare back home. A nightmare which, by the way, the United States played no small role in helping to create. And it is so counterproductive for this president to say he's going to cut off aid to these countries, because stability and prosperity in those countries at home is the best way to make sure that we don't have unmanageable flows of people trying to come to our country because they have to, because their lives depend on it. That's something we should be coordinating with international partners to do, and part of my foreign policy will be to make sure that happens.
I'm a Navy Afghan vet like you.
Thank you.
What change would you make to our approach in Afghanistan?
So, as you know, this is a pretty hard one to get out of. I thought I was one of the last guys turning out the lights when I left. That was 5 years ago. We're this close to waking up and reading about a casualty in Afghanistan who was not born on 9/11. You know what that means. And as you know, I'm not sure what area you served in, but the mission has become very slippery over there. And so we have to do two things at once. One is to ensure that we get the right kind of counterterrorism assurances so we're not going to be back there. ensure that the international community has a way to secure the advances that have been made, especially around women's rights in that country, that are extraordinary. And at the same time, not allow our mission to devolve into securing the prosperity and stability of the country as a whole. And that's going to require a political settlement. Now, the good news is the Taliban wants to talk. The bad news is this administration seems to be leaving the Afghan government off to the side. And a settlement's not going to work that cuts out the Afghan government. So my goal is to get out of there as quickly as possible. We've got to do it, though, in a way that sets us up for long-term success. And then if we need some kind of special operations or intel capability, fine. We have that in any number of places to keep America safe. But this open-ended presence can't continue, because as you also, what part of the country are we in?
Bagram.
Okay. So when you're at Bagram, you feel the long tail of the Soviet experience, right, all the time. And there's a great warning in that. Now, the other lesson of Afghanistan is the best way to deal with an endless war is to not get into one in the first place. And so I think it's very important to recognize this is not just a matter of presidential power and presidential restraint. We also have to have Congress step up a little more. And I'll propose that authorizations for the use of military force have a 3-year sunset. So if you really need to stay, fine, go back to Congress and get it renewed. But have the debate.
Make the vote on it.
Yeah, because I mean, if you could summon the courage to go serve over there, how can Congress be expected to get away with not having the courage to take a tough vote on whether we ought to still be there? I think that's
What is our path to victory?
all right. Great question. So, most people I met a guy earlier today said, look, I would vote for my neighbor's dog if I thought it could beat Donald Trump. I think that's where most of our heads are. Now, it's also the case that Democrats, God bless us, sometimes overthink electability.
Yeah, that's
Right? The path to victory is not to be so inoffensive that nobody could possibly object, because then nobody gets excited either. I always think about Indiana. We went Democratic once in the last 50 years. Not for Bill Clinton, not for John Kerry, not for Jimmy Carter, for Barack Obama. Now, if we were sitting around in LA in 2007 debating who was going to be such an effective candidate, so electable that even Indiana would vote for Democrat, I don't think Barack Hussein Obama would have been the first name to come up, right? But the point is he moved people. He moved people, and it's about a lot more than ideology. So while it's certainly the case that I'm resisting the temptation to make some of the promises that are being asked of us from the activist wing of the party, while also leaning into a lot of ideas that I think are as bold and as big as anybody out there. I don't think that just being kind of militantly middle of the road is going to work either. This is about forward, not left versus center. And part of how we've gotten this far, I think, and cut through a lot of clutter and gotten ahead of the first 20 or so of my competitors that we've had to get past, now we've got to get through another 4 or so, is by presenting something that is bold and responds to the moment, but also has the promise of unifying us at a moment when we are dangerously polarized and divided in this country. So tactically, what it means is doing well in the earliest states. With your help, which I'm very grateful for, we are now able to put people on the ground. We got about 60 people in Iowa. I think we're in the 40s in New Hampshire. And they're talented, and they're smart, and they're nice. And they're building the relation. The nice part really matters, especially when you're forming these relationships. And it's going to make it possible, knowing that this race probably won't break until the last few days, if not weeks, especially with so many of us. But knowing that when it does, it will be based on all of that unglamorous groundwork happening now. That's the pathway to the nomination. The pathway to the presidency is to debate this president without being sucked into his game.
Yeah, exactly.
The great discipline that will be required of us is to deny him the ability to change the subject, right? We learned that the economy is teetering on the brink of recession. And what are we debating all week? Greenland. Whether to buy Greenland. He has a gift for changing the subject. And so it will be very important as a nominee for me to call out when he does something wrong, correct his lies when he tells a lie, but then immediately return the subject to how your life is going to be different. The less we're talking about him, the more we're talking about you. And the good news is the American people are with us on the subject of how to make your life better. They're with us on healthcare. They're with us even on things like immigration and guns, where we've been on the defensive. They're definitely with us on wages. And we got to make sure we're focusing on that. And when we do, our message that fuses our commitments to social and racial justice and our commitments to making sure that we do right by workers in this country, we'll win. It's just that if you're on his show, even when you're winning, you're losing.
Sir, we have one more question,
Oh, just
please.
one more, okay.
Sorry.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, I wanted to ask about something that you mentioned early on about involuntary draft
Right.
and you're wanting everyone to serve in the military in some way.
So I don't think military service is for everybody. I do think that national service would do us a lot of good. And so one of the plans, alongside our plans on, there's some energy for that. In addition to our plans on mental health and on systemic racism and on rural economic development and on health, one of our signature proposals is about national service. And I want to create 1 million paid national service opportunities by the time we're celebrating our country's 250th birthday. And the thought behind this is not just that there's work that's got to be done. So we'd have a climate corps working on things like weatherization of low-income folks' homes. We would have an intergenerational corps that's helping deal with the social isolation of seniors. It's a big deal. We would have a community health corps that's helping deal with things like mental health and addiction. But it's not just the good work that can be done. It's the experience of having worked with your fellow Americans on something hard. Because when you're deployed, right, you get to know and like and trust people who are totally different from you. Different politically, different generations, different races. And I want everybody to have that experience, but I don't want everybody to have to go to war in order to get it. And so what we can do, if we're willing to fund it, is make national service so widely available that it becomes the norm. That when you are applying, whether it's your first job out of high school or your first, or you're applying to college, the number one question you get on your application is, where were you for your service year and what did you learn? That's how we know we got it. Sounds like our time is just about up. I just want to thank you enough for, first of all, caring enough about where we are to be part of this. Also want to point out that whether we think of it this way or not, participating in this way is an expression of hope. I know that hope has gone out of fashion a little bit in our politics. It's such a bleak moment, but it requires a certain measure of hope to run for office or to help somebody run for office.
Right.
And what I'm relying on you to do more than anything is to spread that sense of hope, that sense of belief that you can get people who look to you for advice or for direction can feel empowered and can still believe that if we get our hands on the pulleys and levers and mechanics of government, we can use them to make people's lives better and redesign them if necessary. Because if we don't, we're just going to be here again. And Lord help us if we got nothing to say to those kids who were asking us what we did in 2020. Now's our chance to be proud of what we did, and I'm looking forward to having